From Eyewitness News, this is Newsmakers.
Bloodshed in Egypt. Hundreds killed as police crack down on protesters and supporters of deposed President Mohamed Morsi. President Obama has condemned the killings as U.S. relations with the new Egyptian regime are under scrutiny. When does bend become break? Then, former NSA contractor Edward Snowden has thrust the country's approach to spying and data gathering into the spotlight. The president last week vowed to work with Congress to reform the program and re-examine the post-9/11 law, the Patriot Act. This week on Newsmakers, Rhode Island's senior senator, Jack Reed.
Good morning. Welcome to Newsmakers. I'm Tim White. Joining me on the panel, WPRI.com reporter Ted Nesi and political reporter from Rhode Island Public Radio, Ian Donis. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Senator, welcome back to the program. It's good to have you.
Thank you.
Let's start with Egypt, and I want to bring up a quote that you gave 1 month ago to Fox News Sunday. This was on July 7th, earlier this summer. You stopped short of calling for the U.S. to stop sending aid to Egypt. This after the military there ousted its elected leader, Mohamed Morsi. You stated, quote, "Will cutting off aid accelerate or enhance the opportunities and the chances to have a truly democratic government? I don't think so." Again, you said this on Fox News early in July. I'm curious what your feelings are now. Should the U.S. cut off or suspend sending more than $1 billion in aid annually?
Well, first, I think the president was actually right in canceling the proposed exercise with the Egyptian military. We have to start signaling strongly that the actions of the last few days are absolutely deplorable. The level of violence, the tactics they used to clear out these demonstrators was completely unacceptable. And I think we have to begin to seriously think about first conditioning the aid on much better performance by the Egyptian military in terms of transition. And if that performance is not forthcoming, to seriously consider canceling the military aid and assistance that is going to them.
So conditioning the aid, not cutting it off, and not suspending.
I think that's
what would a condition look like?
Well, the condition would look like saying that unless there was a strong movement away from these types of tactics of essentially attacking unarmed civilians with military force, if that's repeated, then that could be a condition to suspend aid. And giving the president the opportunity to make that decision. The events of the last 2 days have essentially, I think, been transformative in the sense of indicating what the Egyptian military is prepared to do. I think there was a hope, at least, that they were on the path to a transition to democracy, that they had brought in a coalition, including El Barati, the Nobel Prize winner, as a member of the ruling government. They brought in Islamists as well as secular. So there was this hope that this was moving forward. In the irony, of course, if we had cut off the aid immediately, I think some of the same critics of the president particularly would say, well, that's the reason they overreacted, because we didn't give them any support. Well, now we clearly know that despite continuing to encourage them and support them, they are taking steps that we oppose dramatically. There's a new reality, and that reality is that we have to make them be more observant of the rights of their people.
$1.3 billion in aid goes to the military alone in Egypt. So that is the organization that ousted Mohamed Morsi. Did we subsidize an anti-democracy movement?
Well, it's also the organization that effectively ousted Mubarak. If you think back, it was the military that essentially stepped in and eliminated Mubarak, put him on trial for his crimes, set up an election process that allowed Morsi to be elected by 51% of the vote. So it's unfortunately, like many of these issues, it's a mixed record. They have stepped in to establish the first free elections in the history of the country for 30 years, and then they step in again, but really with a lot of popular support. And when their last efforts to displace Morsi, that was a result of millions of people, secularists, nationalists, non-Islamic, coming to Tahrir Square and demanding that the military step in and protect them from what was becoming a very authoritarian government under Morsi. So it's a very complicated and difficult set of issues. But going forward, we have to be committed to a real transition to democracy. And we have to, at this point, I think the military has demonstrated that they're not interested in much in democratic transformation as they are in creating a security state, and we can't accept that.
Senator, critics say the U.S. has taken a soft line when the military took over from democratically elected Islamic governments in Egypt and Algeria. Has the message been sent to Islamic hardliners that the way to take power and retain it is through violence and not through democracy?
No, I think the message, the hopeful message of the Arab Spring was that democratic transitions would work. It began, as you know, in Tunisia, and they are struggling, but looks like they are making progress, albeit very slow. You've got the same kind of situation in other countries throughout the region where this democratic progress is slow. So it's been, I think, a mixed record across the region. There's some minor successes, but I think we also have to recognize that this transition from authoritarian governments that have been in power for 30, 40, 50, 60 years is not going to take place in a matter of several months, that this is a back and forth that'll take time, a lot of time. And we're dealing with a series of not only political upheavals, but also sectarian clashes, particularly in Syria, where you have Shia, Sunni, and Kurds who are fighting each other on a sectarian basis. So that sectarian clash is also complicating the democratic transition.
The violence in Egypt highlights how the U.S. provides billions of dollars in aid to governments whose actions we don't always sanction. Pakistan comes to mind. Is this just the price of trying to boost security in a messy world, or are you uncomfortable with that?
I think we have to be very, very careful and scrutinize the aid we're giving. The military aid, the principal military aid we give them is to actually acquire American armaments. So they're buying a lot of tanks, and essentially there are some, I think, very sensible critics are saying they don't need them. They're buying F-16 aircraft. We've suspended the transfer of 4 F-16s as a show of our impatience with the military.
And a lot of these are made by American
Oh,
manufacturers.
they're all made by American manufacturers. They're made by, exactly. So this is when we say we're giving aid to the Egyptian military, we're giving them aid, but essentially it's funneling through them to acquire American equipment. That's the biggest part of it. There's a smaller part which I think has some value, much more so than buying the equipment, and that's the military training. Bringing Egyptian officers over here has some value. Although I must say, we thought, given that Al-Sisi, who is the head of the Egyptian military, is a graduate of Fort Leavenworth, has been exposed to our military officers, has a rapport with us, we thought that would count for much more than it seems to have counted for. He is becoming more and more intransigent, directing the oppression of his people. But there are aspects of the program I think could be seriously looked at. And again, my sense is that at a minimum we have to begin to condition these aids to send a stronger signal that we expect, if you're getting our support, then you have to conform to some basic and indeed minimal standards of behavior that the world demands, not just the United States.
Senator, I want to ask you to switch from your armed services hat to your banking committee hat. President Obama's made clear he's considering appointing former Treasury Secretary Larry Summers as the new chairman of the Federal Reserve. Summers doesn't have a lot of fans on the left side of the Democratic Party. Bob Kuttner at the American Prospect said, quote, "He's part of the Robert Rubin crowd that brought us the financial collapse and then worked to save Wall Street from the mess the bankers made." Could you support Larry Summers if President Obama nominates him for Fed chair?
Well, I think the president has several good choices. I've actually joined with some of my colleagues in suggesting that Janet Yellen be made the chairman of the Federal Reserve for reasons.
She's currently the number 2 to Chairman Bernanke.
Well, she's on the board of governors. She's at the headquarters in Washington. She was formerly a president of a regional bank, I believe the San Francisco Bank, and she brings to the process not only a great intellect, and Larry Summers does also, but she has had the recent experience and provide continuity of being on the board when they were making key decisions. And she also has a policy, I think, that the president favors, of trying to continue to stimulate the economy, to continue quantitative easing, begin to withdraw it as the economy recovers, but we still have a long way to go. So for positive reasons, not in opposition to Summers, but because I think she's better prepared for the job, I've been supportive of Janet Yellen.
Let's move on to spying. The Washington Post, we taped this program on a Friday, dropped a big story today on an internal audit. I have questions for you on that, but before we move into that area, just a simple question about Edward Snowden. In your eyes, is he a patriot or a criminal?
Well, I think by his own admission, he's violated American laws. And I think he should subject himself to the jurisdiction of the United States. He should return. He should face the charges. He should make his case in court. I think what he has done, though, is he has certainly alerted the public and policymakers to the need to look carefully, reform, rebalance our collection procedures for the National Security Administration and other intelligence programs. But he did so in a way that, in his own words, I think, suggest that he acknowledges he's violated laws.
How else would he have done it, though, Senator? I mean,
well, he could have walked up to the to a federal court and said, "I have records." He could have stayed in the United States, saying, "I'm prepared to accept the consequences of my revelations." He could have worked with the media in a way that provided the information, even though he still might be subjecting himself to liability. But to flee the country, to go to China first, then to flee to Russia, then to work out an accommodation with the Russians suggests that he really wants the best of both worlds. He wants to, violate our laws and violate our trust too, because he was in a position where he was trusted with this information, and then of course claim that he's really just a patriot. I think he would be much better served, his reputation and himself, if he came back and simply said, I'll put my case before the American people and the American courts.
So one of the things we're learning about this morning in that Post article is he had given them some documentation about some internal audits that showed the NSA overstepped its legal authority thousands of times a year. Some of these incidents were sanitized before being brought to members of Congress, according to the Post. If the country's top spying agency is essentially hiding information about their mistakes from the legislative branch, how confident are you that any oversight changes made by Congress are going to be effective, that they're not just going to be smoke and mirrors?
They can't be smoke and mirrors, because we have to balance the privacy rights and also protecting our country and our citizens from serious threats. And that, I think, can be accomplished. I know in 2012 there was some legislation to reauthorize the FISA courts, and there were amendments that would provide better oversight. I supported those amendments. They didn't pass. But I think in this atmosphere we have to be much more aggressive about getting true accountability from the agencies, making sure that they are scrupulous in terms of their responsibilities under the various statutes. We also, the FISA court, which is the judicial arbiter of all these actions, I think we have to build into that a process where there is an advocate for civil liberties. It could come out of the Justice Department, where you have trained attorneys who are able to challenge the NSA and others when they come in on civil liberty grounds. Right now it's much more one-sided, where NSA comes in, the judge listens, they grant the authority, they put conditions on it, but I think you need that kind of dynamic between someone charged with and specifically required to protect civil liberties.
All right, we have to take a break here on Newsmakers. When we come back, our conversation with U.S. Senator Jack Reed continues. Stay with us. You're watching Newsmakers. Welcome back to Newsmakers. I'm Tim White. To my right, Ted Nesi and Ian Donis. Our guest this week is U.S. Senator Jack Reed. Ted.
Senator, we've done a lot of policy, but I'm going to ask a little politics now. Not about your own race, because Nate Silver says you have a 99% chance of winning re-election next year, though I know you don't take anything for granted. Okay. But we have a big race for governor coming among the Democrats, and your former chief of staff, J.B. Persh, is advising Providence Mayor Angel Taveras. People in Providence widely assume that wouldn't have happened if you didn't give your blessing. Did J.B. Persh or Angel Taveras talk to you before they joined up?
No.
No?
No, I wouldn't presume to advise either J.B., who's a very talented national political expert. He ran the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee and basically engineered kind of the new majority in the Senate. I wouldn't presume to tell J.B. or anyone else either to go work someplace or to hire someone.
So this isn't a sign that Angel Taveras is the Jack Reed candidate in 2014 for governor?
Absolutely not.
If the election were today between what is expected to be a Democratic field of Lincoln Chafee, Gina Raimondo, and Angel Taveras, who would you vote for?
The election is not today. No, seriously, it's a long way.
You know.
The candidates have not declared. There's a lot of movement. My commitment, as it always been, is to elect a Democratic governor.
So,
and to work hard.
Hadn't gone so well then the last bunch of times.
No, but I've been there, and I will be there again in November of 2014. First of all, because I don't take my race for granted, working hard to get the confidence of the American people of Rhode Island to run again and serve again, and then also to help the Democratic candidate for governor.
You welcomed a new Democrat into the ranks, your former colleague, our governor, Lincoln Chafee, switched from an independent to a Democrat. Did he call you before he was going to do that?
He simply called to indicate hours before that he was going to do that.
So that morning, or did...
Maybe the previous afternoon, that morning.
I like specifics. What did you say to him?
I just, good luck, basically. It was not a deliberation. I was no consultation, no discussion. It was his choice, personal choice, But he was, I think, gracious enough to inform me and others, I presume.
Did it surprise you, or did you see that one coming?
It wasn't a complete surprise. One, he had moved from the Republican Party to the independent column. He had been very supportive of President Obama both in 2008 and in 2012. So he was clearly, I think, signaling that he was getting more and more comfortable in the Democratic Party.
To switch gears slightly, you've expressed concern about possible negative unintended consequences from the drone war. The Obama administration has made very extensive use of drones. It's been effective against Islamic militants, but civilians have died, collateral damage. Do you think, on the whole, the program has been more positive or negative as far as U.S. interests and security?
I think to this point, the program has provided us the tremendous advantages of going out and disrupting and degrading al-Qaeda and terrorist elements. I think, though, like any program, if left unchecked, the program sort of takes on a momentum of its own. I think we have to be very, very careful now in calculating not just the effect in terms of taking these targets down, but also the popular effect. Pakistan, I've traveled there many, many times, hugely unpopular, even though the Pakistan government allows us to operate, but still there's a cost to doing this. And I think we have to constantly reevaluate the cost and benefits. It's a weapon system that's very effective, but it cannot sort of override policy and override the politics in a general sense.
Senator, we had some rough job numbers for Rhode Island yesterday. The state has only added back 9,000 of the 40,000 jobs almost that Rhode Island lost during the Great Recession. Obviously, it's been a tough time for the whole country, but Rhode Island's done particularly poorly. I'm just wondering, when you sit back in your office and try to think what's wrong with my home state, what do you think has gone wrong in the Rhode Island economy that we are having so much trouble even just picking up the same pace as the nation?
Right. Well, I think there are other parts of the country, for example, that have commodities. If you're in the Dakotas with shale gas, you have 4.5% unemployment. That's because you have a commodity that is a world product and you can sell. Some agricultural commodities the same way. In states that don't have commodities, and we're obviously one of them, you're not getting this boom from the energy revolution. That's one aspect of it too. I think also too that we have to do more in terms of fiscal demand, of putting money into the economy, and that's why the austerity politics that are being practiced in Washington, I think, are not helping our employment situation. There are several pieces of legislation that we tried to get through in the last Congress and the beginning of this Congress that would have incentivized more hiring. There are infrastructure plans that I think would be very helpful that the President's proposing that we think would benefit Rhode Island, not just in terms of the short run, but the long run in terms of a more efficient infrastructure. One of the projects which I think over time is going to be very helpful is the expansion of Green Airport. And we've managed not only the state and the city have done yeoman's work getting us to the point where we can get federal assistance, but we've got significant federal assistance, about 60+%.
Well, you've had to meet with the FAA a number of times, right?
I've been on the phone constantly with Director Wetler of the FAA so that he would be knowledgeable and supportive, and they've been terrific. There's 3 projects. First, a glycol for the de-icing facility going in place, safety, and then the extension of the runway. Once the runway is extended, then we should be able to compete for long-distance aircraft, which we can't now. So those are some of the programs I hope in the long run, but the growth here in Rhode Island is much too slow, and we've got to do more. As the economy rises, we've seen a little bit of a rise, but not enough. We have to really break through, and I think From the Washington perspective, we have to just invest more, and that's why when it's frustrating to run into some of the austerity measures that are being proposed by particularly the Republican House.
Pivoting back to Egypt for a moment, it seems that everybody out there is using the word coup except for the Obama administration. What's your view? Do you think this is a military coup?
This is one of those arguments where it's a legal argument, but I think it misses the policy point. The policy point is, what do we have to do to transition that government, which is propped up by the military, to a true inclusive democratic government?
Explain why that word is so sensitive to the Obama administration.
It's very sensitive because there is statutory language, I believe, that goes back to the 80s, that automatically and immediately cuts off all military assistance to a country that has had a coup d'etat or there's other language associated with it. And so if the president is speaking in those terms, the concern is, and the reality perhaps, is that it would automatically trigger, without concern for the policy implications, a cutoff of aid. I think, as I've suggested before, we have to be, particularly after the last few days, be much more critical of the Egyptian military, much more willing to condition or cut off aid, but I don't think that should be driven by sort of a legal definition that was put into the law several years ago and doesn't fully, I think, embrace the reality of what's happening in Egypt today.
What is the timeline that you need set to whether or not that you would cut off aid? You had said earlier in the first half of the show conditions on the aid. So what are we looking at here? 2 weeks, 4 weeks, months?
I think we're looking at, first of all, they set out a timetable for elections that roughly, I think it's about 270 days, a ballpark figure. But what I think we have to do, particularly after the events of the last few days, is to look on a day-to-day basis. Are they coming back to a much more balanced and a much more appropriate position? If they're not, then I don't think we should have an arbitrary date of unless they're ready on May 1st, we'll cut it off, or October 1st.
Okay. You've got a bill that Reuters said would, if it becomes law, would offer the biggest boost since 2010 to the Enforcement Division of the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission. If that becomes law, what else needs to be done to prevent the kind of boondoggles on Wall Street that helped influence the Great Recession?
Well, the legislation you spoke about, Ian, would double the statute of limitations from 5 years to 10 years, so the SEC can go back. And some of these schemes are so complicated and so complex, by the time they become aware of them and figure them out, the 5 years could have elapsed and essentially people will get a free pass. That should not be the case. That's one aspect. The second aspect is much more general, and that is getting the regulations written for Dodd-Frank. We still have to get Volcker Rule regulations out and operative. There's a host of other regulations that have to be proposed. And if we do that, then I think, first of all, the industry will know precisely where they are, which will help them eliminate uncertainty, and we'll have in place much more stringent and more appropriate rules for the economy we face today.
Is too big to fail still a problem?
Too big to fail is always a problem, but there's another aspect to this which we learned to our chagrin in the crisis. Too interconnected to fail is also a critical issue. Size is one aspect of the problem. The other aspect is where all these relationships. For example, Lehman, when they failed, they had one of the mutual funds had so much of their mortgage-backed security paper that they were in danger of failing. The Fed had to step in. So it's not just size. Size is important. And I think what we did in Dodd-Frank is we gave not only the Federal Reserve more power, but we gave them a much more of an incentive to increase the capital that these institutions have to hold, and also to ensure that they don't take on excessive debt, and that their term of their debt is matched up with their assets, so they're not borrowing short for long-term assets. So I think the regulators, one, have the better tools, and two, much more motivation to use those tools. I think one of the leading contributing factors to the collapse in 2008 was the whole deregulatory spirit of Greenspan and the Bush administration and many others saying we don't need to regulate.
Should Glass-Steagall be reinstated?
I don't think necessarily it should be reinstated, because I think essentially what you have now is institutions that have already sort of morphed beyond the simple bank and the investment bank of the 1930s. One of the ironies, of course, is, you know, Bear Stearns and Lehman, the two institutions that collapsed and sort of led the way, would not have been directly subject to Glass-Steagall. They were investment banks regulated by the SEC. They weren't depository institutions. So I think what you really want to do in practice is ensure that there's adequate capital, there's not over-leveraged institutions, and that we are trying to eliminate these interconnections. And one thing that we did in Dodd-Frank
30 seconds, Senator.
is try to get all these derivatives, these complicated products, onto markets so they could be priced by the market, not individually by the banks to their own advantage.
U.S. Senator Jack Reed, we sincerely appreciate you appearing
Thanks,
on the
Tim.
program. We hope to have you back real soon.
Thank you.
If you missed any of it, you can catch it online, WPRI.com, under the on-air section. For Ted Nisi and Ian Donis, we thank you for watching. I'm Tim White, and we will see you next week on Newsmakers. Senator